The research vessel Orpheon drifted in slow orbit above Vrynn 3, its observation panels glowing faintly with reflected starlight. From a distance, the planet looked almost peaceful, a sphere of bronze deserts and dark winding oceans. But the data scrolling across Marcus Hale's console told a harsher story. Violent electrical storms, unstable tectonic zones, and atmospheric currents strong enough to peel the plating from an unshielded shuttle. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as the ship's artificial gravity shifted slightly to compensate for a maneuvering thruster. The adjustment made his coffee ripple in its cup. He watched the liquid wobble and muttered, "One day I'm going to invent a mug that stabilizes itself. I'd be rich within a week." The ship's onboard assistant responded immediately. "You made the same statement yesterday." "And the day before," Marcus admitted. "Consistency is important in science." He stood and stretched, glancing out the observation panel again. Somewhere down on that planet lived the Vrynn, one of the most misunderstood species in the explored sectors, if Marcus believed even half of what he'd read. Savage, brutal, dangerous. The words appeared again and again in official reports, repeated so often they had become almost meaningless. Marcus had learned long ago that labels were usually the least accurate part of any scientific record. A chime sounded at the cabin door. "Come in," Marcus said, still staring at the planet. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and he turned, expecting to see one of the human technicians or perhaps a logistics officer. Instead, he found himself facing Kyreth. She stood in the doorway, tall and perfectly still, her posture so balanced it almost seemed sculpted rather than natural. At first glance, she looked human. Smooth skin, dark eyes, features calm and symmetrical. But then his gaze shifted, and the differences became clear. Her ears were long and elegantly pointed, sweeping back along her head in a shape both delicate and striking. She wore a fitted uniform reinforced with flexible plating, the fabric marked with geometric patterns Marcus didn't recognize. There was nothing overtly threatening about her, yet there was a presence in the way she held herself, a quiet certainty that made the room feel smaller. "You are Marcus Hale," she said. Her voice was low and steady, each word pronounced with precise clarity. "I am," Marcus replied. "And you must be Kyreth." She inclined her head slightly as if acknowledging a formal introduction that only she could see. "I have been assigned as your liaison," she said. "You are to begin planetary survey coordination tomorrow." Marcus nodded, gesturing toward the empty chair across from his console. "Please sit. Unless sitting is, I don't know, an insult on Vrynn 3. Kyreth blinked once, clearly uncertain whether he was serious. "It is not an insult," she said at last, and sat. Marcus tried not to smile at the faint stiffness in her movement, as if she were unused to chairs designed for humans. "I should warn you," he said, "I have a reputation for asking too many questions." "That is acceptable," Kyreth replied. "I have a reputation for answering them directly." "Well, that sounds efficient," Marcus said. For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's systems. Marcus studied her openly, not out of rudeness but out of habit. Observation was second nature to him. Kyreth noticed. "If you are evaluating me," she said, "you may proceed. I am accustomed to being examined." Marcus blinked, then laughed softly. "I wasn't evaluating you. I was wondering whether the uniform is comfortable. It looks like it could stop a meteor." "It can stop a blade," she replied. "Meteors are less predictable." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Fair point." A faint pause followed, and then, unexpectedly, Kyreth said, "Most researchers avoid looking directly at me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "They find my species unsettling." Marcus considered that for a moment, then shrugged. "I've seen organisms that dissolve their prey externally and then drink the result through pores in their skin. You don't rank very high on my unsettling scale." Kyreth stared at him, and for an instant he thought he might have offended her. Then very faintly the corner of her mouth twitched. Marcus leaned back, relieved. "That might be the first time I've successfully told a joke to someone from another species." "It was not entirely a joke," she said. "No," Marcus admitted. "It wasn't." They began reviewing survey data, projecting atmospheric charts and geological scans between them in holographic layers. Kyreth worked with swift, precise motions, adjusting variables and cross-checking readings with an efficiency that impressed Marcus immediately. "You're fast," he said after a while. "I am trained," she replied simply. Marcus hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever get tired of people assuming things about you?" Kyreth's hands paused over the controls. "Yes," she said quietly. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a flat certainty that made Marcus feel as though he had brushed against something deeper than he intended. He cleared his throat and pointed to a cluster of storm systems rotating over the planet's equator. "Those electrical fields, have they always been that intense?" Kyreth resumed her work, and the moment passed, but Marcus sensed that the conversation had opened a door, even if only slightly. Hours later, as they finished their preparations, the station lights dimmed to simulate evening cycle. The stars outside burned steadily, cold and distant. Marcus gathered his notes, then glanced at Kyreth, who was standing by the observation panel, looking down at the planet. "Beautiful," he said softly, meaning the view. Kyreth turned slightly as if unsure whether he meant the world below or something else entirely. Marcus followed her gaze to the storms flickering across the darkened surface of Vrynn 3. "Dangerous," he added, "but beautiful." Kyreth studied the planet for a long moment before speaking. "Yes," she said. And though Marcus did not yet realize it, that single shared word marked the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. The morning cycle aboard the Orpheon began not with sunlight, but with a gradual shift in the spectrum of the ceiling panels, the artificial dawn moving from deep violet to a pale, warm gold. Marcus woke to the soft vibration of the station systems, transitioning to daytime operations, and lay still for a moment, listening to the faint hum of circulation vents and distant machinery. He swung his legs off the bed, reached for his data pad, and immediately dropped it. The gravity had shifted again. "Wonderful," he muttered, retrieving the device from the floor. "One day we'll invent artificial gravity that doesn't feel like a seasick elevator." The onboard assistant replied, "Your complaint has been logged." "I wasn't complaining," Marcus said, rubbing his eyes. "I was philosophizing." He dressed quickly and headed for the laboratory module, where he found Kyreth already working. She stood at a long console, reviewing atmospheric samples projected in midair, the shifting holograms casting faint patterns of light across her face and the long curve of her ears. "You're early," Marcus said. "I am on time," Kyreth replied without looking up. Marcus glanced at the clock. He was, in fact, 10 minutes late. "Right," he said. "Then I am early for being late." Kyreth turned to him slowly, clearly uncertain how to interpret that statement. Marcus smiled. "It's a human thing. We cope with embarrassment by making illogical sentences." "I see," she said, though it was obvious she did not. They began the day's work, coordinating the descent of survey drones into the upper atmosphere of Vrynn 3. On the main display, the small probes streaked downward, their hulls glowing as they cut through turbulent layers of ionized gas. Kyreth monitored the telemetry with intense focus, adjusting flight paths with rapid, precise movements. Marcus watched her for a moment, struck again by the quiet discipline in everything she did. "You ever notice," he said, "that drones always look confident until the moment they start falling?" "They are not falling," Kyreth said. "They are descending very quickly in a direction they did not originally intend," Marcus replied. One of the drones shuddered violently on the screen as it passed through a charged storm layer. Marcus winced. "That one," he added, "is having a philosophical crisis." Kyreth stared at him, and for a moment he thought she might ignore the remark. Then, unexpectedly, she made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It was so brief Marcus almost thought he imagined it. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft chime of incoming data and the distant vibration of the ship's engines. At length, Marcus said, "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask," Kyreth replied. "Why do people say your species is savage?" Kyreth's hands paused over the console. "They see what they expect to see," she said. "Our culture values strength. We do not hide our emotions. We do not soften our words. To many species, this appears aggressive." Marcus leaned against the console. "And is it?" "Yes," she said simply. but not in the way they believe. She gestured to the storm systems swirling across the planetary display. A storm is violent. It is also necessary. Without it, the atmosphere would stagnate and life would fail. Strength is the same. Marcus considered that. That's a better explanation than anything I've read in the official files. The official files are written by observers who never stayed long, Kyreth said. Marcus nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. A sudden metallic clatter echoed from the far end of the lab. Marcus turned to see a maintenance drone attempting to stack equipment crates and failing spectacularly. One crate slid off the pile and landed with a loud bang, causing the drone to freeze as if embarrassed. Marcus watched it for a moment. I think it's pretending that didn't happen, he said. Kyreth followed his gaze. Why would it do that? Because, Marcus said solemnly, if you ignore a mistake long enough, sometimes everyone else does too. That has never been true in my experience, Kyreth replied. Ah, Marcus said, you've never worked in academic committees. This time Kyreth's laugh was unmistakable, a quiet, surprised sound that seemed to catch even her off guard. She turned away quickly, as if uncertain whether she should have allowed it. Marcus pretended not to notice, giving her the small courtesy of normality. Later, during a break, they sat in the observation lounge, watching the planet rotate below. The storms had shifted, revealing vast stretches of desert broken by jagged mountain ranges that cast long shadows across the surface. It is strange, Marcus said. From up here, everything looks calm. Kyreth studied the view. Distance hides many things. Marcus glanced at her. Is that something your people say? No, she said. It is something I have learned. There was a quiet weight in her words, and Marcus sensed again that there were layers to Kyreth he was only beginning to see. He decided to lighten the mood. On my first expedition, he said, I spent 3 weeks studying what I believed was a new form of crystalline life. What happened? Kyreth asked. It turned out to be a geological formation, Marcus admitted, a very ordinary one. I had been talking to rocks for 21 days. Kyreth looked at him for a long moment. And, she said. And nothing, Marcus said. They were terrible conversationalists. Kyreth shook her head slightly, though there was a faint smile in her expression. As the stars brightened outside the observation panel, Marcus realized something had changed. The distance between them, so sharp and formal the day before, had begun to soften, replaced by an ease that felt unexpected but natural. Kyreth was still reserved, still controlled, but the rigid edge in her posture had lessened. For the first time, Marcus wondered not what her species was like, but what she was like, and the question, he suspected, would take far longer to answer. The third day of atmospheric sampling began with a minor crisis that, according to the ship's systems, was technically not a crisis at all. Marcus disagreed. It's smoking, he said, pointing at the auxiliary console where a thin ribbon of gray vapor curled lazily upward. It is venting, Kyreth corrected calmly. Smoke is smoke, Marcus replied. If something vents itself into the air, that's a sign it has strong feelings about being used. Kyreth reached over, disengaged a panel, and replaced a burned-out relay in less than 30 seconds. The vapor stopped immediately. It no longer has feelings, she said. Marcus folded his arms. I liked it better when it did. It had personality. Kyreth shook her head faintly and returned to the main console. But Marcus noticed the faintest trace of amusement in her expression. Outside, the storms above Vrynn 3 had intensified, sheets of blue-white lightning branching across entire continents. The survey drones moved carefully through the turbulence, transmitting streams of data back to the ship. Marcus adjusted a holographic display, filtering the readings into layered models of atmospheric chemistry. You know, he said, if anyone had told me that ionized storm belts could form stable spiral structures, I would have accused them of exaggerating. They are not stable, Kyreth said. They only appear so from a distance. Marcus glanced at her. You have a habit of saying things that sound philosophical, he said. I am describing storms, she replied. He smiled. Of course you are. They worked for several hours in companionable silence, broken only by occasional observations in the steady rhythm of data analysis. Marcus found that he had begun to anticipate Kyreth's movements, passing her tools or adjusting displays before she asked. She, in turn, seemed to understand his methods more quickly than most colleagues ever had. At one point, Marcus leaned too far back in his chair while stretching and nearly tipped over. He caught himself at the last second, grabbing the edge of the console. Kyreth looked at him. That maneuver, she said, did not appear intentional. It was a gravity calibration test, Marcus said, straightening. Highly technical. You nearly fell. I nearly succeeded, Marcus corrected. Kyreth turned back to the console, but he saw her shoulders shift slightly, as if suppressing a laugh. Later, during the mid-cycle break, they sat in the laboratory while a maintenance drone hummed softly nearby, polishing the floor with meticulous dedication. Marcus watched it for a while. I admire its focus, he said. If I had that level of concentration, I'd have finished 3 research papers by now. Why have you not finished them? Kyreth asked. Marcus considered. Because I keep discovering things that are more interesting than the papers. Kyreth nodded once, as if that explanation made perfect sense. The conversation drifted to the subject of Vrynn culture. Marcus asked careful questions, and Kyreth answered with quiet precision, describing traditions of discipline, training rituals, and the deep respect her people held for endurance and self-control. We do not praise appearance, she said at one point. It is considered irrelevant. Marcus looked at her thoughtfully but said nothing, sensing that the topic carried weight. The work resumed and the hours passed. It was near the end of the cycle when Marcus noticed Kyreth standing at the far observation panel, studying a projection of the planet's surface. The storms had begun to clear, revealing a vast plain of pale stone cut by winding canyons. Marcus walked over, holding a data pad. That region, he said, pointing to the display, has mineral formations unlike anything I've seen. Almost crystalline, but not quite. Kyreth stepped closer to examine the image. Her expression softened slightly as she studied the terrain, and for a moment the warrior-like composure she carried seemed to fade, replaced by something quieter. Marcus watched her, noticing details he had not allowed himself to notice before. The way the light from the display traced the curve of her cheek, the subtle symmetry of her features, the elegant line of her long ears against the dark background of space. The thought came to him without effort, simple and clear. You're very beautiful, he said. The words were spoken in the same tone he might have used to remark on a landscape or a piece of music. Honest, unguarded, entirely without calculation. Kyreth froze. For a moment she did not move at all. Then she turned slowly to face him, her expression utterly blank, as if the meaning of the words had not yet reached her. Marcus realized what he had said and felt a flicker of uncertainty. I mean, Kyreth opened her mouth to speak. Nothing came out. She closed it again, clearly trying to form a response. Her composure, usually so unshakable, had vanished completely. She began, then stopped. A faint color rose to her face, so subtle Marcus might have missed it if he had not been watching so closely. I do not, she tried again, and then fell silent, looking away abruptly as if the floor had suddenly become fascinating. Marcus blinked. He had expected many reactions, indifference, perhaps mild annoyance, but not this. I'm sorry, he said gently. Was that inappropriate? Kyreth shook her head quickly, still not looking at him. No, she said, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. It was unexpected. They stood in silence for several seconds, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. Marcus searched for something to say that would not make the moment more awkward. Well, he said at last, for what it's worth, I once told a crystalline fungus it had excellent symmetry. It did not react nearly as strongly. Kyreth let out a small, involuntary sound that might have been half a laugh and half a sigh. She still did not meet his eyes. I should return to my work, she said after a moment, her voice steadying slightly. Of course, Marcus replied. She moved back to the console, but her usual fluid precision was gone. She adjusted controls twice before selecting the correct one, and once she stared at a display for several seconds without interacting with it at all. Marcus pretended not to notice, though inwardly he was bewildered by what had just happened. He had spoken without thinking, simply stating what he saw. Yet the effect had been as dramatic as if he had triggered an alarm. Across the room, Kyreth paused, her hand resting lightly on the console. For a fleeting instant, her reflection in the darkened display showed an expression Marcus had never seen on her face before: uncertainty, vulnerability, and something almost fragile. Then the moment passed, and she resumed her work, her posture once again controlled and composed. But the silence between them was no longer the same. Something had shifted, quiet and irreversible, like the first crack in ice that will eventually reshape the entire surface. The next cycle began in a silence that felt unfamiliar. Marcus noticed it immediately, though nothing outwardly seemed different. The laboratory lights glowed as usual, the drones transmitted their streams of atmospheric data, and the distant hum of the ship's engines continued with mechanical indifference. But Kyreth was quieter than before. Not distant, not cold, just careful. She worked with the same precision, but her movements seemed more deliberate, as if she were aware of being observed even when Marcus was focused on his own console. Marcus told himself not to overthink it. People reacted differently to compliments. Some shrugged them off, some denied them, some changed the subject entirely. He had not, however, expected complete linguistic paralysis. He glanced at her, then quickly looked back to his data, unsure whether mentioning the moment would ease the tension or make it worse. The silence stretched until Marcus finally said, "I ran a structural analysis on the storm belt overnight." Kyreth looked up. And? And if those energy patterns intensify another 10%, we may witness atmospheric vortices large enough to disrupt orbital stability. That is significant, she said. Marcus nodded. Also, the simulation predicted a 93% probability that the drones will panic. The drones do not panic. You haven't met Drone 12, Marcus said gravely. It has a dramatic personality. Kyreth exhaled softly, and though it was not quite a laugh, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. They worked in relative calm for a while, reviewing topographical scans of the planet's northern hemisphere. Vast mountain ranges rose from the desert plains like frozen waves, their peaks carved by ancient winds into sharp, angular forms. At one point, a transmission flickered, and the main display briefly filled with static before resolving into a high-resolution scan of a canyon system. Marcus leaned closer. That formation looks almost artificial. Kyreth studied the image. It is natural, but the geometry can be deceptive. Marcus tilted his head. I once spent 6 months studying what I believed to be a ruin left by an extinct civilization. What was it? A mineral deposit shaped like a staircase, Marcus admitted. Nature has an excellent sense of irony. Kyreth shook her head faintly. The conversation drifted, and gradually the earlier awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a cautious familiarity. Still, Marcus noticed small things. When he spoke unexpectedly, Kyreth sometimes hesitated before replying, as if gathering her thoughts. When their hands brushed briefly while adjusting the same console, she withdrew a fraction more quickly than she had before. None of it was dramatic, but it was unmistakable. During the mid-cycle break, they sat in the observation lounge again. The storms below had thinned, revealing a vast inland sea reflecting the light of a distant sun. Marcus sipped his coffee and grimaced. I am convinced, he said, that the ship's food synthesizer is slowly poisoning me. Kyreth glanced at the cup. It is nutritionally balanced. It tastes like regret, Marcus said. Kyreth looked at him, clearly uncertain whether regret had a flavor. It's a metaphor, Marcus added. I am beginning to suspect that humans use metaphors to compensate for imprecise thinking, Kyreth said. Marcus placed a hand over his heart. That is a deeply hurtful and entirely accurate observation. Kyreth's lips curved slightly before she looked away, as if the smile itself surprised her. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the planet turn. Marcus hesitated, then said quietly, I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable yesterday. Kyreth did not answer immediately. At last she said, No one has ever said such a thing to me before. Marcus nodded, waiting. In my culture, she continued, we are praised for strength, endurance, discipline. Appearance is irrelevant. Among other species, we are seen as dangerous or unpleasant. Marcus frowned. That seems like a very limited way to see someone. It is efficient, Kyreth said. Efficiency is not always kindness. Marcus leaned back, considering her words. Well, he said after a moment, for what it's worth, efficiency has never been one of my strengths. I have noticed, Kyreth replied. Marcus laughed. You say that like it's a flaw. It is a statistical observation, she said, but there was warmth in her voice now. Later, back in the laboratory, they prepared a probe for descent into a particularly volatile storm system. The drone hovered in the launch bay, its hull gleaming under the overhead lights. Marcus ran a final diagnostic. All right, he said. If this thing comes back in one piece, I'm naming it. What would you name it? Kyreth asked. Something heroic, Marcus said. Or possibly something sarcastic. I haven't decided yet. You assign names to machines? Of course, Marcus said. It improves morale. Whose morale? Mine, Marcus admitted. Kyreth shook her head, but the faintest trace of amusement lingered in her expression. The launch proceeded smoothly, the drone vanishing into the storm layers with a flash of reflected lightning. As they monitored its descent, Marcus glanced at Kyreth and noticed something he had not seen before. She seemed lighter, not entirely at ease, not fully relaxed, but less guarded, as if some invisible weight had shifted, even if only slightly. Kyreth, he said quietly. Yes? I meant what I said. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. I know, she said. There was no embarrassment in her voice this time, only a quiet certainty that made Marcus feel, for reasons he could not entirely explain, profoundly relieved. The console chimed, announcing the drone's successful entry into the lower atmosphere. Marcus exhaled. Good, he said. I was beginning to think I'd have to give it a heroic memorial speech. Kyreth raised an eyebrow. You would deliver a speech for a machine? I would deliver an excellent speech, Marcus said. Very moving. There would be music. Kyreth looked at him for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, laughed. Softly but without hesitation this time. The sound lingered in the quiet room, warmer than any artificial sunrise, and Marcus realized that whatever had begun to change between them was no longer fragile. It was real. The storm season over Vrynn 3 intensified without warning. It began as a subtle shift in the atmospheric readings, ionization levels climbing, pressure gradients tightening, energy patterns forming unstable spirals that twisted across entire hemispheres. Marcus stared at the data scrolling across his console and felt a familiar thrill mixed with unease. This isn't in the seasonal models, he said. Kyreth stepped beside him, studying the projections. No, it is earlier than expected. On the main display, the storm belts glowed like vast rings of blue fire, lightning branching in arcs hundreds of kilometers long. Even from orbit, the scale was staggering. Marcus exhaled slowly. That's impressive. Impressive is not the word I would use, Kyreth replied. Terrifyingly impressive? Marcus offered. Kyreth gave him a brief look. Closer. A warning tone sounded. One of the survey drones had lost stabilization and was drifting toward the outer edge of a storm vortex. Marcus leaned forward, fingers moving quickly across the controls. Come on, come on. The drone's telemetry flickered, then stabilized as Kyreth rerouted its navigation field. It will hold, she said calmly. Marcus sat back. Remind me never to play strategy games against you. I do not play games, Kyreth said. That's exactly what someone who is very good at games would say, Marcus replied. Kyreth shook her head faintly, but he saw the corner of her mouth lift. The crisis passed, but the atmosphere aboard the ship remained tense. The storms were not only intensifying, they were shifting in patterns no one fully understood. Later in the operations chamber, a small group of researchers gathered around a projection of the planet. Marcus explained the anomalies while Kyreth answered questions about regional atmospheric behavior. One of the visiting technicians, a nervous young man named Reliance, kept glancing at Kyreth as she spoke, as though expecting her to snap at any moment. Marcus noticed. So, Marcus said suddenly, turning to Reliance, did you know Kyreth once fixed a drone in under 30 seconds while it was literally on fire? Kyreth blinked. It was not literally on fire. There was smoke, Marcus insisted. That was a burned relay. Marcus looked back at Relis. Still counts. The technician looked embarrassed, and the tension in the room eased slightly. After the meeting, Kyreth and Marcus walked back through the corridor, the soft glow of overhead lights reflecting off the metal walls. You did not need to say that, Kyreth said quietly. Marcus shrugged. I didn't like the way he was looking at you. He was afraid. Yes, Marcus said, and I find that irritating. Kyreth glanced at him. Why? Marcus thought for a moment. Because fear is often just ignorance wearing armor. They reached the laboratory and Kyreth paused near the doorway, considering his words in silence before stepping inside. The work that evening was quieter, focused on analyzing the storm energy patterns. Marcus found himself distracted, watching the shifting light of the holographic displays reflecting in Kyreth's eyes as she studied the data. At one point, she leaned closer to examine a projection, and a loose strand of her dark hair slipped forward. She brushed it back absently, unaware that Marcus had noticed the gesture. He looked away quickly, pretending to concentrate on his console. After a while, Kyreth said, Marcus. Yes? You do not seem afraid of me. Marcus looked up, surprised by the question. Should I be? He asked. Many are. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering. I've seen creatures that hunt by sensing electrical impulses in the brain, he said. I once met a diplomat who tried to annex a moon by accident. Compared to that, you're remarkably reasonable. Kyreth tilted her head slightly. Annexed a moon by accident? It's a long story, Marcus said. There was a mistranslated treaty and an extremely enthusiastic notary. Kyreth was silent for a moment, then a quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The sound lingered in the air, and Marcus felt a warmth he hadn't expected. The ship shuddered suddenly as a wave of charged particles struck the outer shields. Warning lights flickered briefly, then faded as the systems compensated. Marcus glanced at the readings. Residual storm discharge. Nothing serious. Kyreth nodded, but her gaze remained on the display, her expression thoughtful. My people say that storms reveal what is strongest, she said. Marcus smiled faintly. Humans usually say storms reveal what leaks first. Kyreth looked at him, puzzled. Ships, Marcus clarified. And occasionally umbrellas. I do not know what an umbrella is. You're fortunate, Marcus said. They turn inside out at the worst possible moment. Kyreth shook her head slightly, but the faint smile returned. Hours later, as the work cycle ended, they stood once more at the observation panel. The storms below were beginning to calm, their vast spirals dissolving into scattered bands of cloud. Marcus folded his arms. You know, he said, from up here it almost looks peaceful again. Kyreth studied the planet in silence. Peace, she said at last, is often only a pause. Marcus glanced at her. That sounds like experience speaking. It is, she said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus realized that somewhere along the way, the distance between them had vanished entirely. There was no longer any hesitation in their conversations, no careful politeness, only a quiet understanding that felt as natural as breathing. And yet, beneath that calm, he sensed something else growing, something neither of them had named. Kyreth turned slightly, meeting his eyes. Marcus, she said, when you spoke to me that day, you changed something I did not know could change. Marcus felt his chest tighten slightly, though he wasn't sure why. I'm glad, he said softly. Kyreth held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at the planet below, where the last flickers of lightning faded into darkness. And in the quiet that followed, Marcus understood that whatever lay ahead, storms, discoveries, or dangers he could not yet imagine, he no longer felt as though he were facing them alone. The orbital night stretched long over Vrynn 3, the planet turning slowly beneath the research vessel while scattered lightning flickered like distant signals from another age. Marcus had remained in the laboratory long after most of the station had entered rest cycle. The hum of the environmental systems filled the quiet, steady, and almost soothing. He sat at the console, reviewing atmospheric harmonics that he had already examined twice, then a third time, not because the data required it, but because his mind refused to settle. He was becoming aware of something he had not expected when he first arrived. Anticipation. Not of discoveries or research results, but of conversations. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, light but deliberate. Marcus glanced up just as Kyreth entered the lab. "I thought you had gone to rest," she said. "I tried," Marcus replied. "My brain decided to replay every conversation I've had in the last 10 years instead." Kyreth tilted her head slightly. "That sounds inefficient." "It is the human mind's favorite hobby," Marcus said. She stepped closer, studying the projections hovering above his console. "You are reviewing the storm resonance models again." "Yes," Marcus admitted. "I keep thinking I've missed something." Kyreth folded her arms, her gaze moving across the shifting patterns of energy. "You have not missed anything." Marcus smiled faintly. "You sound very certain." "I am," she said simply. There was a quiet confidence in her voice that Marcus found oddly reassuring. They worked together for a while, refining models and comparing readings from the last 3 planetary rotations. The storm systems were stabilizing now, settling into slower, broader formations. At one point, Marcus leaned back in his chair and stretched, accidentally knocking a small calibration tool off the console. It bounced once on the floor and rolled in a slow, deliberate circle before coming to rest against Kyreth's boot. She picked it up and handed it to him. "You are very destructive with small objects," she observed. "It's a talent," Marcus said. "I once broke a precision instrument by looking at it too intensely." "That does not seem scientifically plausible." "It was emotionally plausible," Marcus replied. Kyreth shook her head faintly, but her eyes held that familiar glimmer of amusement. The quiet returned, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 people who had grown comfortable simply sharing space. After a while, Kyreth spoke. "When I was a child," she said, "I believed that other species could see through us." Marcus glanced at her. "Through you?" "Yes, as if they could see only what they are expected to see, and nothing more." Marcus considered that. "Sometimes that's true," he said. "People see patterns first, individuals later." Kyreth nodded slowly. "But you did not," she said. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I saw someone standing in my doorway who looked like she could repair a smoking console faster than anyone I'd ever met," he said at last. "That was my first impression." Kyreth's lips curved slightly. "And later?" she asked. Marcus met her gaze. "Later I saw someone who laughs at terrible jokes but pretends not to." Kyreth looked away, and for a moment he thought he might have embarrassed her again. But this time the silence felt lighter, almost warm. The station lights dimmed slightly as the vessel entered a shadowed region of orbit. Beyond the observation panel, the stars seemed brighter, scattered across the darkness in vast, silent fields. Marcus stood and walked to the window. Kyreth joined him a moment later. "Do you ever think about how small we are?" Marcus said quietly. "All of this, and we're just 2 people standing in a metal box, watching storms on a distant world." Kyreth studied the stars. "Small does not mean insignificant." Marcus smiled. "You're very good at saying things that sound simple but aren't." "I am only saying what is true," she replied. They stood in silence, watching the slow curve of the planet below. After a while, Marcus said, "I used to think exploration was about discovering new places. And now? Now I think it's about discovering new ways of seeing," he said. Kyreth looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You see differently than most humans," she said. Marcus laughed softly. "That's one way of saying I don't fit in very well. Does that trouble you?" "Not as much as it used to," Marcus said. A faint vibration passed through the hull as the ship adjusted its orbit. The stars shifted slightly in the observation panel, the motion slow and graceful. Kyreth spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "When you spoke to me that day, I did not know how to respond because I had never imagined that anyone could see me in that way." Marcus felt his chest tighten slightly. "I wasn't trying to say anything complicated," he said gently. "I was just saying what I saw." Kyreth looked at him, and for a moment the strength in her expression softened into something more vulnerable. "That is what made it difficult," she said. Marcus searched for words, then gave up, and simply stood beside her in silence. After a while, the quiet grew comfortable again. A maintenance drone drifted past the doorway, paused as if observing them, then continued on its route. Marcus watched it go. I'm convinced those things are secretly judging us. They do not possess judgment protocols, Kyreth said. That's what they want you to think, Marcus replied. Kyreth exhaled softly, the sound almost a laugh. The stars continued to burn beyond the glass, silent and indifferent. But inside the quiet observation deck, something had shifted again. Something deeper, steadier, no longer fragile or uncertain. Marcus realized that whatever this bond between them was, it was no longer defined by curiosity or chance. It had become something deliberate. And as the planet turned slowly beneath them, he understood that the journey they were on was no longer just a scientific mission. It was something far more personal and far more important than he had ever expected. The final survey cycle began with an unexpected calm. Vrynn 3 turned slowly beneath the research vessel, its storms reduced to scattered bands of cloud, the vast electrical spirals that had once dominated the atmosphere, fading into faint, distant flashes. The planet looked almost gentle now, as if the violence of previous weeks had been only a memory. Marcus stood in the laboratory, reviewing the last of the atmospheric data. The models were complete. The anomalies had been mapped and explained. The mission report, once a tangled web of uncertainties, now formed a coherent picture of a world whose weather was driven by deep geothermal currents and magnetospheric tides. It was, by every official measure, a success. And yet Marcus found himself lingering over small details, rereading lines he already knew by heart, reluctant to close the files. "You are delaying," Kyreth said from the doorway. Marcus looked up and smiled faintly, observing carefully. "You have been observing the same data for 20 minutes. I am observing it very carefully," Marcus said. Kyreth stepped into the room, folding her arms. "You do not wish to leave?" Marcus hesitated, then sighed. "No, I suppose I don't." The words felt strange to him. He had spent most of his life moving from one expedition to another, rarely looking back. But this time felt different. Kyreth studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "You will return." Marcus looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you are curious," she said, "and because you have unfinished questions." Marcus smiled. "That's true." They spent the rest of the cycle finalizing reports and preparing the drones for retrieval. The work went smoothly, almost too smoothly, and Marcus found himself inventing small tasks just to delay the inevitable conclusion. At one point, he disassembled a perfectly functional sensor array, examined it thoughtfully, and then reassembled it. Kyreth watched this in silence for several minutes before saying, "It was not broken." "I know," Marcus said. "I was conducting a morale inspection." "Of the sensor?" "Of myself," Marcus admitted. Kyreth shook her head faintly, though her eyes were warm. Later, as the last drone returned to the hangar bay, the ship's systems announced the completion of all survey objectives. A quiet chime echoed through the corridors, gentle but final. Marcus stood in the observation deck, watching the planet below. The deserts glowed faintly in the light of a distant sun, and the inland sea reflected the sky like a sheet of polished metal. "It looks different now," he said. Kyreth stepped beside him. "The planet has not changed." "No," Marcus said softly. "I have." He realized it was true. When he had first arrived, he had seen Vrynn 3 as a subject of study, a collection of data points and geological processes. Now he saw it as a world, complex, alive, shaped by forces both violent and beautiful. And he saw Kyreth not as a representative of a species, but simply as Kyreth. After a while, she said, "When I first met you, I believed you would fear me." Marcus glanced at her. "You were very intimidating." "I am still intimidating," she said. "Yes," Marcus agreed, "but you're also the person who spent 10 minutes trying to teach a maintenance drone to recognize sarcasm." "It almost succeeded," Kyreth said calmly. Marcus laughed, the sound echoing softly in the quiet deck. They fell silent again, watching the slow movement of clouds far below. "At the beginning of this mission," Kyreth said, "I believed that strength meant never allowing others to see uncertainty." "And now?" Marcus asked. Kyreth was quiet for a moment. Now I think strength is allowing yourself to be seen clearly, she said. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a difficult lesson. Yes, Kyreth said, but you taught it to me. Marcus looked at her surprised. I didn't teach you anything. You showed me, she replied. The words settled between them, quiet and certain. A soft tone sounded from the corridor, signaling that departure preparations had begun. Transport shuttles were being readied, supplies secured, flight paths calculated. The mission was ending. Marcus felt a brief, sharp ache of regret, but it was tempered by something steadier, a sense of completion, of having reached a point that felt natural rather than abrupt. I used to think exploration was about finding new worlds, he said after a while. And now, Kyreth asked, now I think it's about finding new ways to understand the ones you already know. Kyreth considered that, then nodded. They remained at the observation panel until the first stars began to appear, bright against the darkening sky. Finally, Marcus turned to her. Kyreth? Yes? I meant everything I said to you. I know, she said. There was no embarrassment in her voice now, only calm certainty. Marcus realized then how much she had changed, and how much he had changed with her. The guarded warrior who had once struggled to respond to a simple compliment now stood beside him with quiet confidence, no longer defined by the expectations of others. And he, who had once drifted from one assignment to the next without attachment, now understood the value of connection, of staying long enough to truly see someone. A shuttle passed silently outside the observation deck, its lights gliding across the darkness. Marcus exhaled softly. I suppose this is where I start planning my return. Kyreth looked at him. I will expect it. Marcus smiled. They stood together in silence as the planet turned below them. No longer strangers, no longer defined by labels or assumptions, but simply two people who had changed each other in ways neither of them had anticipated. And as the stars burned steadily in the endless dark, Marcus felt, for the first time in many years, completely certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be, even if only for a little while longer.